I'm Matt Groves. I am the Head of Information Worker Solutions at a company called Trinity Expert Systems, one of the big SharePoint solution providers in the UK. I've been with them for just coming up 9 years now. My responsibilities are quite broad, so covering both the kind of business adoption side of SharePoint with our client base, but also technical implementations, customization, development, etc. I'm recognising a couple of familiar faces from my session this morning around the Olympics, so those guys in the room obviously remember who I am. Unless it didn't make much of an impression, in which case, hi, I'm Matt. So, later on tonight, there is quite an event happening, and I appreciate that I am the only thing standing between you and it. If you're not planning on going to the conference party, change your mind. It's going to be awesome. So, I'm going to be covering off cloud migration. So, what does it mean to you to migrate to the cloud? Well, obviously, in order to do that, I'm going to need to give some definitions around what is the cloud, and some of the options, so particularly hybrid, because I think hybrid is going to be the way that most of you will end up being deployed and adopting cloud technologies, and then a load of considerations. I think one of the key things to kind of set some expectation up front, I think this session is going to leave you going away with more questions than answers today. So I'm going to have some of the answers for you, but I'm not going to have all of the answers. But my kind of target, my objective is to make sure that you know all the questions that you need to be going away and thinking about in order to get this right. So, firstly, what is the cloud? It's quite interesting that this morning I spoke a lot about why, with the work that we did with the Olympics, we didn't go cloud. And yet here I am doing a session just a couple of hours later about why you should go to the cloud. I was sat talking with John in the speaker room about why we thought that there was this massive difference. And it is largely because it's a very different story now. So some of the reasons that the Olympic guys didn't go for the cloud was there was a lack of feature parity, whereas now it's getting really, really close. So the choice, that decision point that you've now got of do you go to cloud, do you go on-premise, do you go private cloud, is actually now a much harder decision to make because you've got so much. So the difference between the offerings is much smaller now. So, quick definition of the cloud. Click. From Anthony. So what is cloud computing? The bits that we really care about are that it is convenient, it's rapid, it's on demand. It can be made available to you very, very quickly. That is one of the key benefits of it. To give you an example, Facebook took 5 years to get to 250 million users, and then another 8 months to double it. So they could only have that level of elasticity if they were in the cloud. Trying to do that kind of thing in the traditional IT service model was just never going to work. So why would you go to the cloud? So this is the slide that I put in from my session this morning. It really just demonstrates that we have moved on. And 5 years ago we were talking here at the conference about the birth of Office 365 and how much of a viable option that was going to be for you. And with every passing year, it becomes a more and more viable choice. Interestingly, although it was the stated strategy that the LOCOG guys, LOCOG being the London Organising Committee of the Olympic Games, LOCOG, that they weren't going to go with cloud technologies, because of the massive advancement in the cloud technologies from 2007 to 2012, they did actually end up doing some service provision on the cloud. So how many people nominated someone for bearing the torch, being a torch carrier around the? One person. Okay. So, but you're all aware of the Olympic torch and the relay and through the country and saw it all in the media. So the site where you logged on to nominate someone was actually hosted on Azure, cloud platform. Anyway, the point being, we've moved on. Cloud is a massive topic. I'm not going to go into all the technical ins and outs of all these different options. If you'd like to talk more about it, then grab myself, John, Paul, Anthony, any of the guys after the session. We're happy to talk to you further about it. Some of the key things to take away, though, is it's a shift in mindset. It's a paradigm shift from the way that you may be looking at delivering IT services today. Sorry, a bit too quick. So some of the reasons as to why you would go to cloud. So elasticity is obviously one of them, reduced cost. Although actually, that one point, reduced cost, is it actually going to be reduced cost? That is a really key consideration. That's like, always first on the list of people when they think, so why would we go to the cloud? And you go, well, it's cheaper. It might not be. Depending on the scenario that you're looking at doing, it might not be a cheap option for you, particularly when you consider some of the other things around provider lock-in, migration, et cetera, et cetera. So, the options I'm going to be focusing on really today are these. So primarily Office 365. Is there anyone in the room who's not aware of Office 365 as an offering? Good. So Office 365, private cloud are the two main ones, but I am also going to touch briefly on infrastructure as a service and software as a service. I'm not going to focus so much on platform as a service, over there on the right, desktop as a service, or data center as a service. They're not entirely applicable, but particularly data center as a service might be where you end up going. Those are fundamentally the options, and a couple of reasons why. So, obviously, I have to offset that with why not. Well, a quote that I've used for many, many years now is that the cloud is for anyone, but it's not necessarily for everyone. So it's an option, but it might not be for you. Think about it. There are going to be challenges, which I'm going to come on to cover. One of the things that you really, really need to give some consideration to as CIOs, as IT directors, as IT service providers within your organisation, is what the organisation is actually asking you to do. And do you have a clear understanding of what the organisation is asking you and needing you to do? I think that is a perfect example. Henry Ford built a load of cars. If he'd have gone and asked his customers what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. That's not what they actually got, or not really what they needed. So, a little bit more detail then as to why not. A lot of these elements, I think, are a kind of double-edged sword. On one hand, I could talk about some of these things as a positive thing and a reason to go to Office 365 or private cloud. Equally well, some of these are good reasons to not do it, which is why I said earlier that I'm not necessarily going to be able to give you the answers to everything today, because the points depend on which way you're looking at them. So it's a defined service. In many respects, that's a good thing. It does what it says on the tin. On the other hand, all it does is what it says on the tin. So it depends entirely on your perspective as to whether or not that one simple point is a good thing or a bad thing. I think in a lot of instances, and this is why I'm going to come on to talk about hybrid as one of the main ways of getting there, is for the right scenarios, it's the right thing to do. And obviously for the wrong scenarios, it's the wrong thing to do. Licensing costs, so particularly for Office 365, that may be price appealing for you, depending on where you are with Microsoft licensing. Equally well, it might not actually be that price appealing for you. Outside of Office 365, and you look at private cloud offerings, people from like Rackspace, Outsourcery, et cetera, and obviously a lot of the kind of newer hosting providers that are cropping up, their cost models can be quite varied and actually quite interesting once you start to unpick them. So think about those cost models. I'm going to talk about data sovereignty a little bit later on, but one of the key blockers that I see, and I know that John sees with the work that he does with government and the work that I do with the financial service sector and the legal sector, is about where the data is actually stored. So if you're here in the UK and you register for Office 365, your data is either going to be stored in a data center in Ireland or in the Netherlands. You don't have a choice about that. If you register in the UK, those are the ones that service EMEA. If you need your data to be in the UK for whatever regulatory reason, then Office 365 is pretty much off the table straight away, and you need to look at a private cloud offering. There's also a point that I'll come on to talk about a little bit later on again, which is akin to that, but not necessarily the same thing, which is the Patriot Act. It's a piece of American legislation. How many people are aware of what the Patriot Act means? Okay, so the Patriot Act is a very, very important piece of legislation in America. What it basically means is that because Microsoft are obviously an American-owned and operating company, that the US government, in their desire to be proactive around protecting their borders, they tend to be quite zealous about that. They have this. They enacted the Patriot Act, which basically means that Microsoft can be subject to a subpoena from the government to open the door on their data center and have a look at the data. There are two types of subpoena that can be issued. You can either have an open subpoena, in which case, as a client of Microsoft, as an organization that's buying Office 365 from them, then you can be told about that data access. Can't really do anything about it, but you will be told about it. The other type of subpoena is a closed subpoena, where Microsoft cannot tell you about it. The last time that I spoke to anyone in MSIT or anyone responsible for Office 365 and asked them the question, how many of these have you actually processed? The answer was none. So it's a key consideration. Microsoft have the thing is though, if they've been issued closed ones, they probably couldn't tell us anyway. But they've not been asked to open up the doors to the US government. So other reasons to not go to the cloud. Things are not available. That's less of an issue now. One of the things that John and I were doing as we were pulling some things together for this, we looked at some old slides, some that John had done, some that I had done, and you look back to the kind of the BPOS days, and there was massive difference between what you could and couldn't do on-premise versus the cloud, and that has really gone away now. There are still things that you can't do. A lot of those things that you can't do today in Office 365 are on the roadmap that you will be able to do at some point in the future. But obviously, if they're key things for you, then you need to be aware of the timings and look at the dependencies for before you make that business decision. And just a little note, Office 365, if you're looking at telephony, I know we're here talking about SharePoint primarily, but if you're buying into Office 365, you might be interested in Link. The E4 subscription gets you enterprise voice. It doesn't necessarily give you the enterprise voice offering that you would actually want. So if you're thinking about going Office 365 for voice, I'm not saying think again and don't do it. I'm just saying, like I'm saying for the rest of the cloud stuff, be acutely aware of what you can and can't achieve. Because once you're bought into it, you kind of bought into it for a little period of time there. And of course, development is less limited now. Sandbox solutions were the previous way that we did that, and obviously now we've got the app model. In terms of trends, what are we seeing? I'm sure we all read the same kind of literature online and the same kind of magazines around IT. How many people are not considering cloud at all and are just going, no, not interested? It's a really daft question actually, because if you were thinking that, you probably wouldn't have come to this session, would you? But that's indicative of every organisation. Everyone is genuinely looking at cloud as an option. Not everyone's going there, and I know in a lot of your work, John, you don't see customers going to the cloud because of some really good regulatory reasons as to why they can't. Working in the financial service sector as I do, I see things that customers can't do. So think about it. One of the things that we do see is non-central purchasing of cloud solutions. So a department who uses its own departmental budget to go and buy something because they don't need IT to provision anything, they don't need IT to manage it, to back it up, etc., etc. So they just go off and do it. That, I think, is probably going to be one of the massive double-edged swords of cloud technologies, because that's going to be great for adoption, but that's going to be really, really worrying for your information governance and your data protection and making sure that you know where all your data is, that it's properly backed up, properly governed, etc., etc. Because that leads me nicely into the Wild West file sharing. So how many people have interest, by the way, are on the kind of service provider side, and how many are actually kind of the end clients, as I would look at you from my perspective? So how many are service providers? How many in-house? That, I guess, means that the rest of you are just other. Okay. So how many people don't have customers who have got a problem with SkyDrive, Dropbox, Box.net, etc.? It's all over the place. It is a massive, massive problem, particularly where you've got corporate iPad usage. That's where I kind of see that it correlates, that users who can't access easily SharePoint instances because their iPad doesn't give them the remote access technology, and even if it did give them remote access technology, the user experience isn't necessarily what's desired. Compare that to what you get from SkyDrive, to, well, a lesser extent on iPad, but certainly Dropbox, Box.net, Google Drive. It's a really simple, easy sharing experience. And I think that's probably one of the areas where Microsoft really needs to catch up. SkyDrive Pro is pretty good, but it's not quite at the same level of end user usability as things like Dropbox. And obviously the focus to just doing more with less. Everyone's budgets are constrained. Everyone needs to be making more out of their investments that they've already got. So cloud might be the answer to that. One of the things that Paul provided me was quite an interesting little stat, that the GCATS, the government catalogue of providers, has over 25 cloud providers listed, which is quite a lot. It was more than I was expecting. And the price difference was really what kind of blew me away, that the price difference is between 50 pence per user per month to £20 per user per month. The thing that that kind of really reinforces that to me, the point that it's reinforcing rather, is they're therefore not offering the same thing. Because if they were offering the same thing, there'd maybe be 18 to 19 pounds price, or there'd be 50 pence to £1, not 50 pence to £20. That is a massive variance. So another kind of key consideration when you're looking at particularly private cloud, what are you actually getting for your money? What is it that you're buying into? You may actually be, look at Office 365 as an example. Office 365 has three main bits to it. You've got SharePoint, you've got Link, and you've got Exchange. If you're only really interested in the SharePoint bit, then you probably don't want to subscribe to Office 365. You want to go and subscribe to SharePoint Online. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're paying for Link and you're paying for Exchange, and you don't need them. Exactly the same kind of story with a lot of the other private cloud providers, that they can give you a suite of things, and you need to make sure that you're choosing the most appropriate one for your needs. I don't work directly in sales, so I can talk quite openly about life in sales. A lot of the sales guys for these cloud providers will paint you a magnificently rosy picture of what it would be like to be served by them and go into their cloud offering. The reality is sometimes quite different. So I guess the summary from that is kind of buyer beware. Once you kind of bought in for your 12 months and you've spent all that money migrating, it's going to be an interesting challenge to come out. So hybrid cloud. This is where I think the future is for most organisations. So outside of the government sector, although G-Cloud is going to address that to a large extent, but hybrid cloud, having some of your services running in the cloud, some of them on-premise, some of them public cloud, i.e. software as a service from Microsoft as an example from 365, all things, private cloud offerings from multiple different types of vendors, is I think where we're going to end up. But there are some very, very key considerations that you need to think about. So let's say that you're in a hybrid model where you've got SharePoint on-premise, because you've got that today, maybe, and you buy into Office 365, so you've got SharePoint Online as well. Key consideration then is, what do you use which one for? You've got it on-premise, what do you use that for? You've got it in the cloud, what do you use that for? Think about that from a perspective of policy, guidance to the user community. One of the prerequisites to that I'll come on to talk about is data classification. Note how I avoided the use of the word governance. I think that's much overused. I much prefer policy and guidance, but it's basically governance. So this is the way that the IT service provision, I think, is going to move to. And I think in terms, if I could put a graph against this, most people, I think, are here. That they'll have on-premise, or they'll have their own data centers provisioned, which is basically on-premises. That is probably where most people are today. Public cloud is probably where the fewest people are today, and private cloud is probably going to be somewhere in the middle. Over the next few years, I see a huge shift from on-premise to both of these, but primarily that one. I think using public cloud will increase, particularly small businesses. It's an absolute no-brainer, really, for a small business. Looking at the price point of Office 365 and that per user per month model, no on-premise infrastructure required, no IT department. If you're a 50-person organisation, Office 365 is just a no-brainer. You wouldn't even need to have a conversation about it. You just do it. For larger organisations, and particularly those that are geographically dispersed, then again, it can be really, really compelling because it takes away the need for some of the complex and expensive WAN links. But I think that the biggest challenges, and one of the things that I know John sees a lot of, is people being concerned around being locked in to a vendor. And I've mentioned it a few times that once you've migrated and you've taken your on-premise data and you've put it into someone's private cloud, it's taken you time, it's cost you money, it's then going to not necessarily stack up in terms of a business case to leave them. Because at some point you might need to leave them. At some point, commercial agreements don't last forever. You may have a falling out with your vendor. They may fail to offer the service that you thought that you were buying, in which case you're tied in. It doesn't make financial sense to move away from them. So you notice that I think there are a lot of the same drivers for cloud, so be that public or private, but then specifically private cloud. But private cloud addresses some of the key concerns, I think, is really where things are going. So data sovereignty. If you have a data sovereignty issue because of your regulatory compliance that you can't put data in Ireland and you can't put data in the Netherlands, then private cloud is going to be a really viable option for you because public cloud isn't. Until someone gives us a public cloud offering of SharePoint in the UK, hosted in the UK, with data in the UK. But I don't see that coming. As far as I'm aware, that's not on a Microsoft roadmap to ever do with Office 365. So you need to live with that. But bear in mind, most industry regulations stipulate EU rather than UK. It's a common point of misunderstanding that I see with a lot of clients, that they think that because of the way that they're regulated, they need to keep the data in the UK. And actually, when you look at it, it says EU, and there's just a lot of paranoia about where data is stored. There are some regulations that mean it has to be stored in the UK. That's granted. I'm not denying that. But there are some that are EU specific rather than UK specific. Equally, there are some that actually people are just making up what they're quoting and referencing. I see that a few times that people will say, oh, well, because of the Solicitor's Regulatory Authority guidelines, we can't put our data outside the UK. It's rubbish, absolute rubbish. Payment on usage is a really interesting point. I'm going to come on to cover this a little bit later. Sorry, is there a question at the back? Mm-hmm. So the question from Matt at the back is that he sees some customers that are regulated but are prepared to put certain bits of data on a platform that doesn't comply with what they need it to comply with, but they're happy to take the risk. Do I see that? I don't see a huge amount of that, to be perfectly honest. We, as an organisation, Trinity, have our own private cloud offering, and we're going through the process of increasing the level of accreditation that has. So, not really is the straightforward answer to that. Most of the organisations that we're working with are either looking at not going Office 365 and going private cloud because of that regulation. There are very few that are prepared to take the risk, largely because of the way that they're regulated. Trinity do a lot of work with the financial service sector and the legal sector, and also with local and regional government. We don't do a huge amount with big central government stuff, as John does. And I would say that certainly from a central government perspective, they just wouldn't. No. Does that answer your question, Matt? Grand. So that leads us nicely into data sovereignty and the Patriot Act. So bear in mind, data sovereignty is applicable irrespective of where the data, what system the data is in. And also, obviously, if you're an international organisation, you're geographically dispersed, then you may need to have some data in the UK that only lives in the UK. There's an interesting piece of, again, American legislation called ITAR, which is around organisations that are involved in the manufacture or the sale of arms, as in weapons. And what that means is that some of the data that's under ITAR classification can only exist in the US and can only be seen by a US citizen, which is quite an interesting challenge when you're looking at bringing down organisational silos and allowing people to work collaboratively internationally. Because one of the things that a client of ours did was to say, right, so here's the SharePoint instance in the US. This cannot be accessed by an IP address that is not within our ranges for our US offices. Therefore, even though we've got firewall protection, so it's all blocked at the firewall level between the US and the UK, you still couldn't get to it. American citizen was then working in their Edinburgh office, couldn't access the data because their policies had not thought about, well, actually, not all of our staff who are based in the US spend all of their time in the US. So that's another interesting piece of I'd never come across ITAR before, but it's a fascinating piece of legislation. One of the big challenges that you do need to think about, particularly if you are geographically dispersed, you've got international offices, is local legislation. So here in the UK, we have our own laws. We're also subject to EU law. A couple of the countries that stand out as being less than easy, well, Germany in particular, is less than easy around data protection, sensitivity of information, particularly personally identifiable information, PII. They're very, very hot on that. The other key consideration is, although your provider that you're looking at might have their primary data center here in the UK, if they have a problem, where is their backup data center? Where's their secondary and their tertiary data centers? We've deliberately done ours all in the UK so that our clients aren't subject to this kind of problem. But there are some providers out there who fail over to elsewhere in Europe if there is a problem with their UK instance. So think about that. You've got at the point that you've invoked DR, or rather that your service provider has invoked DR, you're then not compliant with all the things that you need to be compliant with because your data is now somewhere else. If you'd like to talk more about data sovereignty, it's not really my pet topic, but it is Paul's. So Paul, who sat at the back there, would love to talk to you more, particularly if you buy him a beer tonight over data sovereignty. So when you're looking at selecting a private cloud vendor, there's obviously a lot of things. I've got some questions for you to take away later on. One of the things that I think you need to pay a lot of attention to is a lot of detail things. I'm not going to get into the technical detail. You've probably got people that work for you that handle the technical detail for you. One of the standout things is thin provisioning. What that means is, so if you've spec'd your infrastructure, in fact, that's a whole other point as well, isn't it? You have spec'd your infrastructure. So if you're going to a private cloud vendor and buying an infrastructure as a service from them, you're still designing it. Don't expect that generic IT service provider who just does infrastructure to know how to design your SharePoint, your Exchange, your CRM, etc., because they probably won't. Anyway, so after you've designed your infrastructure and you've said, well, let's take a single box example to keep it really simple, that you want 4 cores and a load of memory. What the service provider is very likely to do is only give you 2 cores and flex up when they need to 4 cores. That's one of the things about cloud elasticity, compute on demand. However, you're going to be paying for 4 cores. So that one day at month end, when the system's heavily used, you'll get 4 cores as you've been paying for. The remaining 19 or 20 days of the month, you're using 2, paying for 4. And that's also an interesting model when you look at things like Amazon Web Services. So has anyone looked at putting SharePoint in Amazon Web Services or Azure? Yeah? Quite an interesting model, I think. particularly with the answer to the question, so how much is this going to cost? That's a really, really interesting question to ask. How much does hosting SharePoint cost? Because you can go to Microsoft and it'll cost you a set fee per user per month. Go to Amazon Web Services or Azure or various of the other online infrastructure as a service offerings, and the cost depends how much you use it. And actually, although both of those organizations, both Microsoft with Azure and Amazon, give you tools to try and help you calculate that cost, you need to know a lot of information for that to be anywhere close to being accurate. Who now could tell me what level of disk I/O they need from their SQL server to support the level of use for SharePoint? Well, I know you could, John. Those are the kind of questions that you need to answer in order to know what it's going to cost, because disk IOPS are one of the costed factors on Amazon Web Services. How are you going to know that? Don't guess. Do try and work it out. So coming into the three pillars. So considerations for going to SharePoint Online. Look at your data, your people, and your applications. So data, that's an interesting one. I was going to put a quote in here around that there's more digital information right now, this minute, than there was 20 years ago or whatever it is. That, you know, in that 1 minute that's elapsed, we've created more digital data than we did in a whole year 20 years ago, something like that. But I thought the picture of the man skiing away from lots and lots of data was more amusing. So the key thing is you will end up with more data. That is a fact. It is indisputable. Anyone who thinks that this time next year you're going to be storing less data in your organization, you're living in cuckoo land. One of the biggest challenges of looking at cloud, looking at migrating to the cloud, is working out what you've got. So how many people can hand on heart say, how many people can hand on heart say that they know how much data they would need to migrate to the cloud? Exactly. You don't really know. So job number one, go and work out how much data you've got, where it is, who owns it, etc. So, information drives data, data impacts infrastructure, infrastructure obviously influences where you can put the data. They are intrinsically linked. If you don't really know or think about one of them, then you're going to have some problems. I'm going to come on to talk about people, but people are a problem, aren't they? If it wasn't for people, we wouldn't have all these challenges. But the data that is obviously generated by people, who needs access to it? That is just such a really basic thing. It's an obvious thing. And as a consultant, I go out and ask these kind of questions to clients all the time. You've got this, this new site that you want to create, this new service that you want to offer the business. Who needs access to it? Quite often, I'll get a blank look back at me. I don't know. People in this department, probably. Maybe some people in this other department over here. And of course, Joe needs access, because Joe needs access to everything. And that's not written down anywhere. No one's really thought about it. There are another few sessions on that kind of thing this week in this track. I know Sharon covered off some stuff. But it's a key thing. And obviously, in terms of data volumes, the more you have of it, the more it is going to cost. That is a key metric of every cloud provider, apart from Microsoft. So Microsoft Office 365, every tenant, so every subscription that you have, you get a certain amount of data, and then every user that you buy on top of that, you get another bit of data in the pool. You can buy more data if you want to, but most of the other providers operate in a slightly different model, which is, how much data is it? That's X pounds per month per gig. So the more data you have, the more it's going to cost you. Really, really simple. Mapping personas and usage patterns is something that I see very, very little of taking place in organisations. And actually, I did a really interesting exercise with a city-based insurer quite recently, trying to help them work out what applications needed to get delivered to an iPad. And so asking simple questions like, well, so who in the organisation is going to have an iPad? Are they going to buy that themselves, or is the organisation going to issue it to them? What do they need to do on that iPad? What are the applications that we therefore need to deliver? What's the data that needs to be delivered? Come up with a matrix that maps personas to devices to functions. And then you'll get a much better understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, probably one of the biggest disruptive things that is happening in IT at the moment is bring your own device. Who has a defined policy on bring your own device within the organisation? Not many people. How many are aware that you should have one? Yeah, really, really should. It is so disruptive. You know, you've got people, so for example, this is obviously my Trinity laptop. You know, they issued me this laptop, and I've got company data on it. It's subject to data encryption and protection and backup and blah, 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 and it's restricted and I can't do everything that I want to do. However, my personal iPhone is my personal iPhone. I hooked it up to company exchange. I've therefore got company data on a personal device. Thankfully, we have a policy around that, but in your organisation, you thought enough about that? Anyway, digress. So, applications. Migrating, you know, we've spoken a lot about migrating data, you know, just big lots of documents and list items and all that SharePoint goodness, but what about the actual functionality? Have you got a good handle on what functionally people are using within your SharePoint instances today? If you don't, then you need to get that. The more you've got out of the box, the better, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a really big advocate of sticking with out of the box unless you really need to customize. Obviously, there's an entire track running downstairs with the devs who have a completely different view on the world, that they're all about the customization. If you're going to buy into a platform like SharePoint, then buy into the platform. The way to drive ROI is to use the platform that you've bought into. By all means, do some configuration, but you don't have to crank open Visual Studio for everything. And the more you've got on-premise out of the box, the easier your migration is going to be to the cloud. Because there's going to be things that you can't migrate because your developers have created something that just does not work in a cloud scenario. And that, again, is a key decision point, because if those applications that have been created are that intrinsically valuable to the organisation, then that's probably going to rule out and put a big cross against going to Office 365. Other massive consideration is, at what point of the year are you going to do the cloud migration? A lot of that, I think, is going to hinge on how long it's going to take you to do it. As you're not going to want to do it this time of year, because you've got a lot of financial processing to happen this time of year. You're probably not going to want to do it in the summer, because loads of your staff are going to be on leave. So that's going to be a problem. Autumn time, well, you know, people going back to school, university, that might be a bit of an issue. Christmas, well, you know, no one wants to be doing this kind of work at Christmas, do they? Everyone wants to take a bit of time off. And then, you know, the early bit of the year, no one wants to start a big complex project early in the year, do they? So when are you going to do your migration project? If it's going to take you 18 months, 3-4 years to get migrated, then, you know, when you start is obviously less important than when you finish. But if you're looking at a 3-month migration period, then that's you know, a key consideration. This is going really well on the timings. You'll be able to get to the party nice and early. So, a few calls to action. The biggest single consideration, by far and away, because this is a really nice broad brush conceptual statement, kind of catch-all. Does the provider that you're looking at fit with your organisational's culture? So there's some technical stuff that you can compare. So SLAs, do they map across to your business SLAs? Because if they can't meet, you know, if your internal SLA exceeds what the vendor can give you, then they're probably not going to be the right vendor for you. Simple as. But you might need widespread organisational changes in order to just go to any cloud provider, let alone one out of the many that are there. So just to give you a couple of examples of that. So help desk process, ticket logging. You know, it's something that, as you know, providing an IT service, you have a ticket logging system, because everyone does. If that system is, well, if the system itself is hosted by someone else, then you probably have to sort this out a little bit more urgently. But at what point in your ticket logging and resolution process do you interact with your vendor? Because at the moment, if you don't have any cloud-hosted solutions, you don't need to worry about interacting with vendors. So therefore, do you need to kind of roll that out to other areas of business process? If you've got other systems and solutions that are supported in a model where you would need a different vendor to be involved somewhere in the chain of events. The other key thing is to be clear on what you're buying and therefore what you're being sold. And the reason that I put it like that is that they're sometimes two different things. What you think you're buying as opposed to what you're being sold might not actually map up and marry against each other, particularly in the world of infrastructure as a service. I mentioned around that the design is still your responsibility. There are very, very few providers out there that are actually going to design the infrastructure. There are many that are going to host it for you, but there are very few that are going to do the designs for you. The key thing that I think is often overlooked is moving your SharePoint instance up to a private cloud provider and making it their problem. It's not their problem when your business can't function. Their problem is making SharePoint work. If you're reliant upon SharePoint working to run your business, then you're kind of scuppered, aren't you? They're not going to be responsible for that business continuity of your business. They'll be responsible for the restoration of the SharePoint service. All that other stuff is your responsibility. So, some things that you need to go away. So I mentioned that job one is working out what data you've got, where it is, who owns it, etc., etc. Classifying the data, particularly as you move towards the hybrid model, is absolutely key. If you've got an on-premise deployment and you've got a cloud deployment, then which data are you going to put where? The general rule that I've seen a lot of organizations look at is that the more sensitive the information, the more likely they are to keep it on-premise. And conversely, the more interactive and collaborative that data, particularly outside the firewall, the more likely they are to put it outside their firewall. So Office 365 is a really, really good choice, in my opinion, and Microsoft's opinion, obviously, for extranets, particularly with the change to the licensing model recently, where you can have a huge number of external people and it doesn't cost you a bean. 50,000, isn't it, Paul? Yeah. So for you have a tenant on Office 365, so you as an organization sign up to Office 365. If you've got 10 users in Office 365, you can still have 50,000 external users for no additional cost. Perfect extranet platform. Therefore, in terms of data classification, you need to be very, very acutely aware of what you're looking to put in the cloud or conversely keep on-premise. Therefore, you need to train and educate your staff as to what data is going to go where and make sure that is, and I'm a big fan of the carrot method rather than the stick, but at some point you're probably going to have to start policing things and using the stick to make sure that people are putting data in the appropriate places. Process review. Mainly around IT touch points. So where your business process touch your IT systems, that's the point at which you can say, is this going to be viable to going to the cloud? For SharePoint, probably less of an issue than a more kind of wholesale migration to the cloud, but it's a key decision point, absolutely key. And obviously the pillars that we spoke about. Now, some other things that might be a problem for you. Testing. Every solution that you have in your business, you would hope, has been properly and thoroughly tested before it was released to the end users. If you've got SharePoint in Office 365, where's your test environment coming from? Where you're used to deploying stuff on premises, you've got your production environment on premises, and what you probably did, as a lot of organizations did, is snapshot your production environment and turn it into a DR test environment. What you should have done, as most organizations fail to do, is actually build your pre-production environments first before you even think about production. But anyway, if you've got SharePoint running in Office 365, how are you going to test what you're going to put out to the business? Microsoft are not going to give you free of charge another test environment, so you might need to think about provisioning on-prem or into a private cloud somewhere to do your testing. Identity. Now, this is just a massive challenge for the IT landscape moving forwards, that managing identity between lots of different clouds is going to be a big problem. It's a big problem for a lot of people already today. You sign into your local Active Directory, life's easy. How do you then map that Active Directory identity across to something that's in someone else's cloud? There are lots of solutions out there today for that. There is some standards that are SAML 2, is that properly ratified yet? Yep. So we're getting close to standards that everyone's going to work with. In education, it's Shibboleth is one of the authentication standards that's used. But managing that identity, the way to think about it is in your personal life, how many identities do you have? How many usernames and passwords do you have? So you've got your work one, you've got your personal email, eBay, Facebook, Amazon, on and on and on and on it goes. Map that to a world of clouds, and each user in your organization is going to have that many identities, and they're going to expect you as IT service professionals to manage that for them. Mobility and bring your own device, I've already covered. Seeing as I'm being recorded, I'm not going to tell you exactly what SO stands for, but when you're looking at any kind of migration, be that to the cloud or not, any kind of system migration, if your data is not in a good state when it went in, it's not going to be in a good state when it comes out. And that's exactly the same when you're looking at migrating to SharePoint Online. If your instance at the moment, if your data structures, your site collections, your lists, your libraries, et cetera, if they're in a mess today, migrating them to the cloud is not going to solve that problem. It really isn't. And interestingly, a lot of these challenges, particularly around kind of user training, I don't think it's going to be the new starters in your organization that are going to be the problem. I think it's going to be the old guard, those people that are used to working in a certain way, that are going to be the problem. They're going to be your focus around user testing and user training. Key thing to look at, service level agreements. How many people have actually read the service description for Office 365? How many people enjoyed reading the Office description for the service description of Office 365? No one. Really boring document, but you need to read it and you need to understand it, and you need to be aware that it changes. Changes at least quarterly. Be very, very aware of what's in that service level description. Mostly, the changes are good news because something's being added, or a limit is being lifted, or the number of items that you can put in a list is going up, or whatever it may be. But be very, very aware when that service description changes. Microsoft will tell you proactively, but you need to make sure that you're aware of what's happening. That flows nicely into other providers. So a lot of the other providers of private cloud offerings are not as rigorous and as proactive as Microsoft are in that area. So key consideration for you. The other thing is, so that the SLA that they're able to offer you, so Office 365 gives you an SLA that is based around uptime, availability only. If it's performing like a dog, it doesn't matter. It's up, it works. Microsoft, green tick. Actually, they might go to amber if it's really, really slow. But the service level agreement does not cover level of performance. So if you've got a, particularly prevalent really for things like month-end, quarter-end, year-end processing, if the system that you're reliant upon is running slow, and it means that you can't do your quarter-end processing, and you've got no comeback at all on Microsoft, because Microsoft will say, here's the stats. The system was up. We have delivered on our obligation to you as a service provider. However, because it was running very, very slowly, that's impacted your business. How are you going to fix that? The other thing is roadmap. Be very, very aware of what Microsoft and other providers are doing in the future, because that's going to influence the decision that you make now. You need to know what they're going to do, because if you do the calculation and actually going to the cloud makes financial sense, but there's this one thing that you can't do, if you can wait 6 months to do that one thing, then that might stack up. And of course, regulatory compliance. It's a subject that that Paul and John here know far better than I around regulatory compliance. Very few private cloud vendors are as certified as they need to be in order to deliver the services to you. It's kind of acronym bingo, really. there's a lot of letters and numbers involved in the regulations and accreditations. Be aware of how you're regulated and set yourself a benchmark, a level of what you expect your provider to be able to comply with. And also be aware that simply having a provider that ticks all of those boxes doesn't necessarily make them a suitable supplier for you to work with. I always used to make the same point around document and records management systems. I'm talking in the SharePoint context, that SharePoint never really been, it's never had the big rubber stamp of approval from loads of organizations around records management. However, it's a perfectly viable records management system. The other records management systems that have all of the rubber stamps and all the certificates to say that they comply with all of the standards that they need to, does not make them a usable or a viable records management system. A lot of organizations that I've seen over the years have actually ended up using SharePoint even though they didn't consciously want to. So London Olympics is a really good example, as I was just talking about it this morning. They chose LiveLink as document management system, and we ended up, this is deliciously ironic really, we ended up policing their use of SharePoint to prevent them putting documents in it that needed to go into LiveLink. We were the anti-adoption police to stop people using SharePoint for what it was designed to be used for, because it needed to go into LiveLink. Anyway, sorry, I digress once again. So, key migration considerations. Not just the end capacity that you need, but also any increase in capacity that you need short-term to facilitate the migration. That, again, is something that's commonly overlooked, that while you're migrating, you are going to be pumping a lot of data down some network links. You are going to be growing transaction logs within SQL. You're going to be doing all those things that mean that your capacity while you're migrating needs to be up here, even though after you finish migration, your capacity needs to be down here. So make sure that your vendors and your suppliers can cope with the amount of data that you're going to need to push them in the amount of time that you need to push it to them. Tooling, we could do a session in its own right about migration tooling. In the SharePoint context, there are some really good tools out there from people like AvePoint. And I speak personally from the experience that we've had using the AvePoint tools. Metalogix is pretty good as well. But think about tooling. And obviously there's a cost to tooling, but it will make the process much easier potentially, particularly if you're well structured. So if your data structure is pretty much nailed today, then pointing the AvePoint tool at it, and by the way, I don't work with AvePoint, I'm not associated with AvePoint anyway, I just happen to have used their tool and quite liked it. Point AvePoint at your on-premise implementation and tell them to just move it up there, and that's what they do, and it just works. It's really, really good. The other thing, of course, is roles and responsibility. Make sure that you're aware of who's going to be responsible for what while you're migrating. And also, again, commonly overlooked thing, what changes do you need to put into your business continuity plan while you're migrating? Because when your data is halfway between one place and another, what's your DR position? Commonly overlooked by a lot of people. And also, another thing that is commonly overlooked, and I know John's really, really passionate about this one, is making sure that you can get out of that vendor when you need to. There's no point thinking that you're signing up for the next however many years, because you're probably not going to be. At some point, you're going to need to migrate away from that provider. Make sure that that provider has mechanisms where you can migrate away from them. Go and ask one of the Microsoft guys about migrating away from Office 365, and they'll go, "Oh, why would you want to do that? You won't want to do that. It's brilliant. Stay forever." And that's kind of the, Google Apps has exactly the same kind of view. Migrating away from Google Apps. No, don't migrate away from Google Apps, say their salespeople. Stay on Google Apps. Stay paying us money forever and ever. Which is why there's a lot of the tooling available, because it's not easy. They genuinely don't make it that easy. So key consideration, give it some real thought. There's a lot of risks involved, obviously. There isn't enough hours in the day to put down all of the conceivable risks of migrating to the cloud. But continuity and ownership of the data is probably the biggest thing that you need to think about. I said I'd give you a list of questions to go away with. So here's a list of questions to think about and some questions to ask the vendors when you're going through your vendor selection processes. The top one, obviously, is unlikely to happen, we would hope. However, one of the IT service providers in the UK recently went out of business, 2E2. Some of our new clients were ex-clients of 2E2, big 50-something million pound turnover company in the UK, just the UK operation, just the professional services bit, gone. Pretty much overnight. So it's a key consideration, which is why you look at Amazon, Microsoft, Google, big international organisations that are probably not going to disappear overnight. I think if Microsoft disappeared overnight, then we'd all have something to worry about, wouldn't we? And John and I'd be back laying bricks on a northern building site somewhere. Another key thing is escalation. So internally, you'll know where the escalation points are. You need to know that for your suppliers. And lastly, some things to not do. Do not think that going to SharePoint Online or Office 365 or a private cloud is an all or nothing gig, because it isn't. Hybrid is, I think, where you're going to end up being. Some of the most basic services will go into the cloud. Others you'll probably end up keeping on-premise for a period of time. It's just the way that I think it's going to go. Again, another thing that I've seen a few times is people relying on snapshots as a backup strategy. It's not a backup strategy. It really isn't. And of course, salespeople are there to sell stuff to you, not deliver stuff to you. So don't necessarily always believe what the vendor is telling you. Unless, of course, that vendor happens to be me, John, or Paul, or one of the other trusted guys speaking at the conference here this week. So the other thing to be aware of, service credits. So every cloud vendor that you look at will say, well, it's no problem, we've got this SLA, and if we fail to make that SLA, then you get this amount of money back, or you get service credit so you don't pay for the next month, or whatever it may be, some kind of financial incentive to make sure that if they don't deliver on the SLA, that you don't pay for it. So while SharePoint Online's not online, as an example, and you can't run your business, Microsoft will give you some service credits. Hey, how is that going to help you run your business? It's going to give you a few quid back at the end of the month, or a few dollars back at the end of the month. It's not actually going to help you run your business. So this was taken from John's session this morning that he did around this kind of stuff. Very, very important thing. So with that, I am now literally the only thing standing between you and the party. If anyone has any questions, please feel free. Other than that, thank you very much.